Welcome, students, to Week 8, the current Crossroads policy needs and opportunities. Now, even though we're talking about current policy needs and opportunities, we have to go back first to the last comprehensive immigration reform proposal, because we all know, those of us who work in this field, that the whole system needs reforming. That working on one piece of it without working on other pieces of it is not ultimately going to be effective because the pieces are interlocking. So this hope for comprehensive immigration reform is underneath and around and behind everything else that we're working on in this arena. So we need to go back to the last completely bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform proposal prepared by what they called the Gang of Eight for Republican and for Democratic Congresspeople. So there are 4 different sections of this law. I have assigned a document to you which summarizes the provisions of the legislative proposal. It's complicated. And in fact, it could be even more complicated if you like, because there are links under each section to articles that analyze that section. So that's not required, that's not mandatory, but please feel free to read those if you're curious. But what I plan to do with you this morning is just try to simplify actually what the legislative proposal said and to highlight some of the most important aspects to help you understand. So the first area is entitled Border Security, and it includes an increased number of officers, massively increased, more wall, although not a wall that goes through the whole border, but that is larger than the wall that currently exists, smart enforcement, meaning using technology to enforce the border barrier, and then community monitoring. So that last is a real gift because, of course, the enforcement at the border is known for human rights violations and other kinds of abuses. So community monitoring has the goal of minimizing that. The second area, and actually it's area 3, but I put them together because they're both about enforcement, is interior enforcement. So that focuses initially on E-Verify, which is a mandatory requirement in this proposal for all businesses to ensure that the people that they're hiring are not undocumented. E-Verify exists currently, but it's not mandatory and very few businesses use it. And it's also not, it has a number of glitches. So it would be a greatly expanded and improved E-Verify program. Under this area of interior enforcement is also reforms to asylum, which I thought was interesting. I would think of that as a border issue, but they describe it as an interior issue because the asylum process happens primarily once people are inside the country. So they look at it as an interior enforcement issue. And there are a number of really good reforms here. People would get their work permits within 180 days, it would be a great improvement over what happens currently. There would be no deadlines. So there's a recognition here that because of the trauma that asylum seekers carry, that sometimes they wait before applying for asylum, and there would be no, right now there's a year-long deadline on that. There would be no deadline. Certain persecuted groups could be given asylum as a group instead of each individual person having to apply for it. It explicitly lists domestic violence as a reason for asylum. It expands the definition of trafficking and strengthens it. It requires alternatives to detention. So we wouldn't have this situation anymore where people are sitting in a detention center for years when they haven't committed any crime, when all they did was cross the border and ask for asylum and enter into a vetting process. There would be more trained judges. There would be legal counsel for vulnerable people like migrant minors and disabled people. Right now, there's no automatic legal counsel for them. And at the border, after you pass the credible fear test, you would be able to go to a specially trained asylum officer who really understands asylum rather than having to go through the immigration courts. And this would greatly speed up the process of asylum, and it would also mean that more people who need and deserve asylum would get it. There would also be a strengthened set of due process protections. And again, for advocates in the field, this is a great gift because due process is often ignored in the immigration process. Like I mentioned a minute ago, in many states, there's essentially no habeas corpus, which is one of the rights in the Bill of Rights in the United States. And what that means is that we're supposed to not let people stay in detention for extended periods of time without a hearing. But we don't have a right of habeas corpus. We don't follow due process in every case for people who are seeking asylum or for people who are in any area in the immigration system. So this would really strengthen assuring that people were treated in a way that was in accordance with our deepest values as a country. Then the second area, which I have third, is the reform of the immigrant visa program. This is the most controversial area and would have been the most impactful. That it would have allowed people who are here undocumented to become registered provisional immigrants. They would have to prove that they were contributing their labor, and they would have to do that through the whole time that they were registered provisional immigrants in order to get residency. So that means that you can't be without work for more than 60 days except under certain exceptional conditions. You have to not break any serious laws, meaning that you can't have a felony or 3 or more misdemeanors. You'll have to pay fines and fees and back taxes, and that can be really expensive. And you have to wait 13 years until you're eligible for citizenship. Dreamers and agricultural workers would go through the program faster. They would be able to become citizens within 5 years. There are also other changes to visa categories. So the definition of investor would expand to really welcome a variety of different kinds of entrepreneurs, recognizing that any country wants entrepreneurs. There would be merit visas, so visas that are given on the basis of points. So there could be merit for being a professional, for having STEM points, but also for civic contribution, also for caregivers of American citizens. There is a category for physicians who are willing to serve the poor in urban or rural areas. There's an expanded category for religious workers, which actually would have made it much easier for denominations or church networks with less formal ordination processes to bring religious workers. So Pentecostal denominations would have benefited from that. That's not, by the way, in the document that you received, but that is actually in the legislation. Another provision that would make a huge difference is that if you got an employment-based visa, a sweat visa, you could immediately bring your family with you, your spouse and children. And that would be also a great benefit and strengthen families and strengthen the individuals that were coming to this country. And then the last one, which I find to be just so wonderful and sane, which is that the numbers of people allowed in each employment category would be based on numbers that reflected what we needed as a country economically and in terms of our labor market. What do we need as a country? And that it would be adjusted annually using technology, right? Oh, so sane, right? Wouldn't that be sane? Another provision that gladdened the heart of advocates is that they would return prosecutorial discretion to the judges. So judges used to have that. They used to be able to make exceptions based on their knowledge of the law and their common sense. So remember the story that I told you about the Albanian immigrants who were on their way to their final interview and they were hit by a drunk driver and they missed their interview and their visa was denied. So in that case, a judge with prosecutorial discretion could say, oh, this is ridiculous, and could remove that deportation order. So it would return prosecutorial discretion, would have returned. Then they would reduce the family backlogs to 7 years, so people would not have to wait 20 years. But the cost of that would be that they would not allow any siblings or married adult children over 31. They were able to keep grandparents, which was a huge fight, and the Asian communities were very involved in that fight, the right to bring grandparents. So they would not be eligible for government programs, but nothing new. They're already not eligible for government programs. And the restrictions around people who've committed crimes are tighter even than they are currently. Lastly, there would be support, public-private partnerships for immigrant integration, which again just makes sense and is a really good potential, would be really good potential legislation to have. There's one more category, which has to do with the reforms to non-immigrant visas. So it sets up a new temporary agricultural workers program with safeguards. It expands the temporary program for science or professional workers, and it allows for people entering into these temporary programs to become permanent residents. So you can enter into a temporary program and then later apply to be a permanent resident. So that's great. Students, by the way, would also be able to come for the first time with a dual purpose, so that you could say, I'm coming to study, and if there's a possibility, I want to stay to work. So you've never been able to say that before, even though, of course, that's true in the majority of cases. Then there's a separate provision, which really doesn't fit under any of this, but is a way of responding to the concern of low-income American citizens that immigrants are taking jobs, which is that it funds job opportunities for low-income citizen youth. So that's the bill. You are reading the summary of the bill in the document that I assigned to you, and your prompt this week is to analyze that bill, to identify a couple aspects of the bill that you really agree with strongly and why, and a couple that you disagree with and why. So now we come to the current day, because currently we don't have a comprehensive immigration proposal in front of Congress, and given the level of division in Congress, don't expect to anytime soon, even though the Biden administration came up with a good one that they used to start negotiations, but it didn't go anywhere, which we knew it wouldn't, because it requires a great level of bipartisan collaboration to create this kind of bill. But let me talk for a minute about the hopes and fears of the average moderate Christian who understands the system, which, obviously there are a lot of average moderate Christians who don't understand the system, but and the fears that I'm going to articulate for you are the fears of people who don't understand the system primarily, but the hopes that I want to articulate for you are the hopes of people that do understand the system. So I think there's a lot of consensus among sort of moderate Christians who understand the system. So I want to lay that out for you. And I do want to name that I gave you the Interfaith Immigration Coalition website to look at, because that website expresses really clearly the hopes of people in the faith communities that are progressive. So they're people of different faith traditions and different faith communities, but they agree politically. They have a progressive political perspective. So I want you to see what they have to say as well. So that's why I gave you that. So let me just go through this, and this is my perception. This is not anybody else's, but I think it's pretty accurate. So your average moderate Christian who understands the system wants a generous, streamlined refugee and asylum program with alternatives to detention, foreign policy that supports development, human rights, and security, so that the problem of surges of immigrants comes out of what's going on in their home countries, and the United States has quite a bit of impact on that. So your average moderate Christian who understands the system wants to see foreign policy that doesn't produce large numbers, surges of immigrants. And then reforms to the visa system that respond to employment needs accurately and support families, earned legalization for people that are here, and improved enforcement consistent with humanitarian values. So prosecutorial discretion could be part of that. Deferred deportation would be part of that, recognizing the errors in the system. So although one would hope that the system would get to the point where we wouldn't need deferred deportation, but until it does, that would be a component. So the fears of moderate Christians who don't know very much about the system by and large, and that stop those hopes from being realized, include the fear of prioritizing immigrants over native-born, over citizens, the fear of terrorism, the fear of increased crime, the fear that immigrants would change culture by their numbers. So that's usually talked about under the rubric of chain migration. Sometimes moderate Christians say moderate or conservative Christians say directly, if we let too many Muslims in, we'll have Sharia law and lose our democracy. And a conservative friend of mine said very poignantly, I don't understand the language in my neighborhood store. I feel like an outsider. And I think that's the fear of that experience, which is driving people around this particular point. And then there's a fear that immigrants will game the system, that will not respect law. So this fear of anchor babies, of economic migrants posing as asylum seekers, etc. So let's talk about current issues and opportunities first. I gave you the website of the National Immigration Forum because it's really the best place to go to get legal updates. You have to delve into it a little bit. It's not obvious. There are various places that you can go to get those legal updates on the site, but it's really the most comprehensive place to go to find out what's happening in Washington right now. So here's some of the current issues and opportunities that you'll see in the National Immigration Forum website. So we are accepting Afghan refugees in the United States, but there are concerns that we're not accepting enough of them and that we're not giving them all that they need. So there are various bills around ensuring full protection and integration for Afghan refugees. Temporary protected status. Remember temporary protected status. It can be given to a country for a period of time. Now that period of time refers to when people who are leaving that country are able to come legally to the United States. It doesn't refer to how long they stay. That's a different question. So we just had a Supreme Court decision this week, which I've heard about, but I still need to study, which seems to say that if you entered the country unlawfully, if you entered not at a port, but between the ports, and then your country was given temporary protected status, so you end up having temporary protected status, but you entered unlawfully, that you can never have residency, no matter whether you qualify under one of our categories or not. So if you married a U.S. citizen, it would be irrelevant. You could never have residency. That seems extremely harsh to me. So I need to study it more. But that makes the current concern about TPS for people from Cameroon and Haiti even more important, because we would need to declare that temporary protected status soon so that we don't have a large number of people who are coming unlawfully and then later getting status. We want to make sure that status is available for them from the get-go, from when they need it. There's a really strong push to end MPP, which is the Stay in Mexico program for asylum seekers at the southern border. And that program, when people are in Mexico, not only is that dangerous for the people who most need asylum, but because of the collaboration between the narcotraficantes, the drug traffickers, and organized crime in Mexico and in Central America. So it can be dangerous for people staying at that border, the people who most deserve and need asylum. But for anybody at the border, it's very hard to put together a good legal case. And you need a good legal case to be able to win asylum, even if you completely qualify. So it's very hard to do that on the Mexican side of the border. So people want to do that so that we really give a fair hearing to people who are seeking asylum. Title 42 was a public health measure that essentially closed the border around COVID. And now that not only are there vaccinations, but you can also do screening, effective screening, you can do quarantine. There's a number of advocates saying it's ridiculous to have this public health legislation that just expels people. The administration has been dragging its feet on getting rid of that for the obvious political reason, right? And then there's a big push right now around the budget reconciliation bill. Now, in the United States, the budget reconciliation bill has been used historically by presidents to get legislation through without a filibuster. So both the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, different administrations got different kind of legislation through. They have to be able to prove that legislative change really affects the budget. And so, because it's a budget reconciliation bill, and there's a parliamentarian who decides whether it affects the budget. So some legislators have been trying to include some kind of immigration reform in the budget reconciliation bill for this year, and the parliamentarian has turned them down 2 or 3 times. Their new push is to include humanitarian parole for people that have been in this country since 2011 or before. So we'll see whether or not they get it through. It would make a huge difference because, as we've talked about before, so many of the people that are here undocumented came many years ago. So it would make a big difference for a lot of people if we were able to get that. Humanitarian parole is not permanent residency. It just allows work permits and saves people from deportation, but we would certainly be happy to receive that, those of us who work in this field. There are criminal exclusions, like if you've committed crimes, you're excluded. And there's a big debate about that between the people who feel like that's fine and that makes sense, and people who feel like because our criminal justice system is racially biased in the United States, that that's unfair and that we need to relook at that. So that's the debate, right? Then there's piecemeal legislation that people have been trying to do and get through around dreamers and agricultural workers and essential workers. And that's been tried for dreamers and agricultural workers for many years now, without success. But you never know. We might succeed at some point. Now, the other article that I gave you to read is from the Migration Policy Institute, and it looks at the impact of COVID on the future of immigration, and this is worldwide. I've been talking about the US the whole time, so sorry for those of you who are not in the US, but it's a good case study, and it's what I know most about, obviously. So, but please apply to your context. But the impact of the pandemic is international. The initial impact, of course, is that people stopped traveling, either for work or tourism. Refugees were stuck in place and countries closed borders. There has been a recovery. It's nonlinear. It goes back and forth, up and down. And there is what I valued most about this report is its emphasis on what we need. That what we need with respect not only to COVID, but any other pandemics that come along, is we need a transparent, equitable, risk-proportionate international system for screening, vaccination verification, and quarantine. That's what we need. Whether we'll get there or not is anybody's guess, or whether we'll try to go back to the way things were before, or whether we'll be in a place of chaos and fragmentation, or to what extent any of that will be true. No one knows yet. But it does, those of us who care about migrants in the name and spirit of Jesus, we need to understand what's going to happen with this, and we need to stay conscious of it. So I do want to mention the international student dilemma, which is pandemic related. So there's been legislation for some time in the United States that says that international students must have a certain number of their classes in which they are physically present. Now that requirement was waived during the pandemic, but only about 1 out of 5 international students decided to take courses completely online, because most international students pay the prices to be an international student, which are hefty, because they want to come to the United States or to any country where they're studying, that they want to explore the possibility of long-term residence in that country, or they want the cultural experience of that country. So there's a real debate about what's going to happen to international students. International students are a very important source of ongoing income for academic institutions in any country. And so that debate is very live.